Shortly after Srila Prabhupada sent us to Hawaii in 1969, in those days people didn't have money, they had to go out and get jobs to open a temple. So we were there, and naturally we started, Gorsunder was working, and I also got a job as a secretary, having been a typist with him. So I was pretty much for about 2 months, I guess it was, around a constant non-devotee association. Although the interesting thing was I was chanting all my rounds, getting up at 4:30 or 5:30 in the morning, packing Gorsunder's lunch and my lunch, and then going into town, which was an hour away. And I was very determined and focused about what I was there for, which was to acquire a place and open a center for Srila Prabhupada. In so doing, I got a job as an executive secretary. Even though I had no previous experience, I had great skills. So I got a job with a big company as the secretary to the vice president, which was prestigious and well-paying in those days, not by today's standards. And so what I did was I really focused on this. I worked for about 2.5 months to get this position. Many interviews and many, to do this was an accomplishment. Then suddenly, out of the blue, we got a telegram from Prabhupada. He was arriving in a few days to Hawaii. And I was like, I have to quit my job. There's no one to take care of him because Gorsunder is working, and it meant basically I had just been with him over a year, doing the housework and the cooking and the whatnot, secretary. It meant I had to drop my job and go back to the role that I had, which I never wanted to leave, but it's just that I was focused along this track. So I was very upset. The reason I was very upset that he was coming so soon. First of all, this is Maya, to even think like that. But I was upset because we had 2 wretched aluminum pots. I was accustomed to giving him the best of Altadena milk and the nicest of everything. We had nothing. We were just getting started. It was like we were there less than 2 months. Maybe it was even 6 weeks or something. And I only worked at my brand new job for about 1.5 weeks, and I had to quit. So I was so upset that when we went to pick him up in our funky old orange truck, I would not speak to him. I was livid. Hard to believe, I know. I was so upset. I was just like, how could he do this? I wasn't ready. My mood was, I wasn't ready. This is premature. I wasn't ready. I know this is hard to believe, but I lived through this. So hear me out, please. So he knew, because he always read my mind, Srila Prabhupada's mystic opulences, trust me, I lived with him for over a year. There's tons of him. He could read your mind from 6,000 miles away. He even wrote me a letter once from India. I know your mind. Not a problem, because he had, as I explained yesterday, the siddhis. He actually told me that because the spiritual master is with Krishna at all times, Krishna is in the heart of all living entities. According to what Krishna wants him to know, he could keep up with his disciples in that way, and if you think of him, he will think of you. He even said that. If you're thinking of me, I'm thinking of you. So he can't be limited. This is important, that he can't be limited like an ordinary us, I mean, if the yogis have siddhis, what to speak of a Mahabhagavat like Srila Prabhupada? So, angry young girl, sitting in an old orange truck, a Ford at that. Prabhupada is in the middle, and Gracinda's driving, and I'm here. I was polite, but I was not particularly welcoming, because I didn't know how I was going to fly. I didn't know how I was going to pull this off with no pots and no. I was in anxiety. That was the source of it. So this went on for about a day and a half, and everything clicked back to our usual schedule, which was Prabhupada would get up in the early morning and translate. I would fix the breakfast. He would go for his walk at the beach park. I mean, everything just, even though I was upset, life went on. His schedule never missed a beat. I fixed his room, I fixed his bookcase, had his books, everything was done. It's just that inside I was upset, and he knew it. And I knew it too. I knew my consciousness was not quite right. So our custom was that in the evening, for months, you know, for the whole time, we would sit and chant japa in the evening in front of the deities. This is just what we did. After the class, or after the lecture, or after a program, he and I would just, and sometimes Krishna would sit and chant japa and look at the deities. In this particular 2 days later, it wasn't very long, maybe it was a day and a half, I was sitting right up by the altar, and I had put his Radha Krishna deities on the altar that he carried in his little red doll suitcase. They were up on the altar, nicely decorated, and I was sitting and chanting and looking at the deities. And Srila Prabhupada was way in the back of a room perhaps twice the length and width, a fairly large room. Toward the very back corner, he was sitting and chanting japa. And I was sitting and chanting japa and looking at his deities. And all of a sudden, this huge wave of realization came over me. A feeling of bhakti, of love, of wanting to serve, of divine love. It washed over me. And all these realizations just flooded my consciousness. And I realized I had lost it. I had lost the essence of bhakti. Although I was doing all the right stuff, chanting all the rounds, following all the principles, we were really strict. And all of a sudden I realized I was looking at the deities, and tears started pouring down my face, because I realized I had lost the essence. I'd lost the feeling. You can be doing the external stuff and lose the connection. And that's what had happened. And then I realized why. It was because I had started thinking I was the doer. I had all this. I was a young girl, having just lived with Prabhupada for over a year. I was like not so accustomed to dealing with hardcore karmis. I'm a little more mature now. I can maybe handle it a little better. But then I was starting to think, you've got to work hard to succeed in this world, and I am the doer, and you're the doer. And this is it's a philosophy that's promulgated throughout our society. It's all about you, and you've got to do it. And this had actually poisoned my consciousness to the extent that Krishna had left my consciousness without my ever knowing it. And I was still chanting Hare Krishna 16 rounds every day, and still doing all the right stuff, and offering my food and all that stuff. But Krishna had left my consciousness. And all of these realizations were flooding my mind and my heart. And all of a sudden I realized, this is why he came. He's fishing me out again, because he could see from Los Angeles, where he was, he could see what was happening to me. And I realized all this. Meantime, he doesn't see my face. He's way back at the other part of the room. But at this point, I realized he came to save me. The temple would never have been opened if I had continued down the path that I was going. I turned to look at him like this. He didn't say a word. He was looking at me very intensely. He just nodded. That's all. Not a word was ever spoken. That's a divine transmission. That's what an acharya can do. He can enter into your heart and your mind and completely rewire you. That's the most incredibly mystical experience I had with Srila Prabhupada.
We missed seeing him at the airport, so we saw him at the University of Detroit that evening. And it was one of those large lecture halls that sloped down from the rear toward the front with a stage in the front. And I was standing in the front, right front, next to, I think, Gokula Prabhu, mechanic for the Radha Damodar buses. And at a certain point, we heard a muffled kirtan, so we all turned toward the rear of the auditorium. And we looked at the right rear doors, and we could see just the tips of dundas and a couple of devotees' heads who were pretty tall. And so obviously the group was coming toward the center doors, so our eyes automatically went toward the center doors. And the doors opened, and I saw Srila Prabhupada, and he was so radiant and effulgent. When I was young, I used to read a book called Lives of the Saints. I was raised Catholic. And so I always noticed I was noticing some of the qualities that were common with the saints. They radiated peace and power because of their intimate connection with the Supreme. They were concerned for the welfare of others, and they were able to create miracles in the lives of others. So when I saw Srila Prabhupada, that's exactly what I thought of. I just was like struck, whoa, this person is obviously intimately connected with the Supreme. He's radiating peace and power. And I sensed that he was concerned for the welfare of others, and he could perform miracles in the lives of others. It was an overwhelming sense of joy, relief, and that realization. And so actually I began to cry a bit because I was just overwhelmed. But that was the realization that the saints are not dead. The saints are alive and well.
3 days into the movement, as a new bhakta, one evening I saw a lot of people running hither and thither. There was a lot of commotion, and everybody was saying, Prabhupada this, Prabhupada that, and then I heard one person say, Prabhupada's coming. And I looked at one devotee and I said, who is Prabhupada? And that devotee told me, he says, Prabhupada is that personality that's come to deliver you from the material world. Well, right about that time, all of us new bhaktas, we got shipped up to San Francisco on the back of a flatbed truck. I remember thinking as we were traveling on the truck, I think, wow, join the Hare Krishnas and see the world. I had never previously been out of LA my entire life, and I joined the Hare Krishna. Next thing I'm going to the famous city of San Francisco. And it was so adventurous. I was, the breeze was on me. I was going up and down. When we got there, I was going up and down these, huge streets and hills, and So anyway, that evening, I had my first taste ever of halava, and it was unbelievable and quite an experience for me. And I just, oh my gosh, I love this, halava. And I shaved up that evening. The next morning, we're in the Berkeley Temple, about 300 or 400 of us, devotees, packed tight. And we were all waiting for Prabhupada to come into the room. And everyone was chanting japa. And there was the hum of chanting japa. And all of a sudden, from the corner of the room, the curtain opened. And I'm not exaggerating. It was literally, when Prabhupada stepped out, first of all, I could tell this person was not from this world. Like Jesus Christ said, I'm in this world, but I'm not of it. You could see that this personality, he was, words can almost not express. He was definitely not from this world. I was so struck that I fell to my knees and I started crying like a baby. I just knew that he was that personality that had come to deliver me. I was overwhelmed with emotion. And then Srila Prabhupada walked through the devotees. They made an opening pathway for him, and he walked. I could see he was very small, materially speaking, but he was, as one woman recounted years later, that he was oceanic. He was so powerful, you know. And this Vyasa-san appeared to be like Mount Everest for him. And he literally, he was climbing up to get on this Vyasa-san. This stately gentleman, you know, but not a gentleman of this world, clearly a completely transcendental spiritual personality. So he got up on the Vyasa-san, and you know how Prabhupada's big eyes, and he'd look around the room, and as he put on his cartails and wrapped them very purposefully around each finger, and then he began to chant, Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. By this time, the entire atmosphere of that room was completely surcharged with spiritual energy. I was in the spiritual world. So this was my experience of Srila Prabhupada. Oh, I don't know if I mentioned that when he came out from that curtain, I am not exaggerating, it was like the sun had entered the room. The room just filled with light when Prabhupada stepped out of that curtain. That's another reason I knew he wasn't an ordinary personality, because there was just this effulgence that came with him. He was enveloped in it.
I first began my spiritual quest in Boston in the early 70s, 1972. And I had seen in Boston the Maharishis and the Munis, and I wasn't too impressed. And I even thought at that time, well, how do I know that I'm not going to be cheated? You know, how do I know if I choose someone that they won't cheat me? And so I decided that meeting my teacher would have to be a very meaningful experience, that it would be something beyond a shadow of a doubt that I would know that he's my teacher, he's my spiritual master. The devotees came from San Diego here to Los Angeles to see Srila Prabhupada. We came one evening, heard evening lecture, and then the next day. And when Srila Prabhupada came for evening lecture, and he sat down, and I was sitting in the back of the temple room, and something just swelled up in my heart, that tears just started coming from my eyes, and like a faucet, not sobbing, just like tears coming out. And I felt like my heart was changing. I felt that there was something in my heart that was prompting this, and it wasn't something I could stop. And the tears were like just dripping from my chin down my face, and the whole time that Srila Prabhupada gave the lecture, this was happening. And I'd heard later that when there's some emotion released in the heart like this, it's spiritual. That this was a further confirmation for me that he's my spiritual master. That for this type of event to happen that was beyond my control was definitely a spiritual experience.
Well, I remember specifically the first time I think that I remember having an interaction with him was in San Francisco, and I was a new devotee, wasn't initiated, but somehow or other I was able to go on the morning walk. And although I knew that Prabhupada was going to be my spiritual master, I wanted a direct confirmation from him. And so I kept looking at him during the walk, trying to catch his gaze. And every time I did, he would avoid it. And so sometime in the walk, maybe towards the end, probably when I least expected it, Prabhupada planted his cane, stopped, and looked directly at me, right through me. And in that brief, fraction of a second, it was as if I became aware that he was Trikalagya, and that I had absolute faith somehow that he knew who I was in my past. He knew what I was thinking. He knew what the future was going to hold for me, and I felt like this, you know, that he was my spiritual master. It was very impactful. It was very impactful. It was like, it felt like a mystical experience. It was almost within that brief second that my soul traveled with his to the end of time, and that I mean, I had like no more questions in my mind, no more doubts ever that I can remember that Prabhupada was, you know, my spiritual master eternally.
I first saw Srila Prabhupada at the airport in 1974 when he was arriving for Rath Yatra. And it was very crowded, and I just remember seeing Srila Prabhupada as much smaller than I expected from his, you know, his pictures. And I just felt really grateful that I could finally see my spiritual master. And then I saw him again on the Rath Yatra cart. I was able to walk along beside him, and he was wearing a little hand-knit cap, and he looked so sweet. And we had a little bit of eye contact then.
Well, it was in 1975 when I first met Srila Prabhupada. I'd gone to Chicago on business a few months before. I think it was in May. I was there on business. And I'd been reading Prabhupada's books for over a year and chanting and started to follow. I lived in Tennessee, and I got Prabhupada's books in Tennessee from a devotee. And so I wanted to find the devotees, and I wanted to find Prabhupada. So I started to visit the Chicago temple when I would go to Chicago on business. And so went to the old Evanston temple. It was in May of 1975, and they said, Prabhupada's going to be here for Rath Yatra in July. And I thought, oh, that's very wonderful. I'll have to come back. So I made a point to be in Evanston when Prabhupada arrived. And so I was in the temple room when Prabhupada came in. Actually just in this little hallway when he came in the front door. And so when Prabhupada came in, I didn't know exactly what to expect. I'd never seen him before, lots of pictures, back to Godhead and whatever, but had never actually seen Prabhupada. And so I was all ready to pay my obeisances, because that's what you do when you see Prabhupada. But Prabhupada walked in the front door, and he walked up these little like 4 or 5 steps, and people threw some flower petals in his way, and he started to walk past, and I just was so amazed at seeing Prabhupada that I just was stunned. I didn't pay obeisance. Everyone else was on the floor, and I was just engrossed in watching Prabhupada walk by. So, and then after he walked by, I paid my obeisances and followed him on into the temple room. So I was pretty amazed to see Srila Prabhupada. I felt like, so this is you. You're the one that's been talking to me in Bhagavad Gita. And immediately it all worked. You know, sometimes if you see somebody, maybe an author, and you think, well, you don't look like the guy that would write the mystery or whatever. But Prabhupada looked the part of the voice that was speaking to me in Bhagavad Gita. So I was very amazed to see Srila Prabhupada.
So within a month or two, we were swept up in working really hard for Rath Yatra. So that's when I first met Prabhupada. It was 1971 when he came for the San Francisco Rath Yatra. And the first time I saw Prabhupada, I wasn't initiated yet, but I knew the etiquette, which was if you see Prabhupada, you pay flat obeisances. So I'm thinking, okay, when I see Prabhupada, I'm going to do that. When he came down, walking down the steps, I guess it was on the tarmac, there wasn't at the airport, I didn't have to think, I got to bow down. It was like a wave, an ocean wave, slammed me down on the ground. So I'm down there, and then I'm staying, and then something comes by, it's like I smell this big whoosh of like gardenia smell, like it was like heavenly. So then I looked up, Prabhupada's walking right by. So that's the first time I saw Prabhupada was Rath Yatra in San Francisco in 1971.
As soon as I saw and heard Prabhupada, I knew this was the pivotal moment of my life. I knew that there was no more doing like I did before. It was like a fork in the road. And it was not a fork that I had expected. It was not one that I had desired. But I knew what I didn't want. I was a conditioned soul who knew that he didn't want any more of that miserable conditioned life. Although my life was a good life, I wasn't suffering in any visible way. But still, I didn't understand why I was living. I didn't understand what the purpose of everything I was doing was. I was really just satisfying third-party expectations, primarily parents, you know. And I was always told how well I was doing and that how great things were going to be. But whenever I attained a level, moving up the material mountain, and I was told that from this altitude, the view would be great, it really never was. And the only thing that I was told to console me was keep climbing, and when you get up even higher, the view will be great. And, you know, it never was. And so I decided that the material mountain does not produce good views. And so I knew that I had to become a follower of Srila Prabhupada, and that was that. I gave all my money to Hari Vilas. It wasn't a lot. I think it was like $500 or $600. And that was that. When we went to Geneva later on, that's when I started feeling some responsibility to do something significant for Prabhupada. Up until that point, it was really just, I was receiving mercy, but I wasn't reciprocating with enough service, I felt. And I liked the idea of having a mission for Prabhupada. So that was a real opportunity for me to serve.
I remember some points that he made in the class. One was that he quoted a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. Very calmly, he was sitting cross-legged with his hands on his knees, with his eyes closed, quoting this verse. Krishna says, if you worship the demigods, you can go to the demigods in your next life. If you worship the ancestors, you can go to the ancestors. If you worship ghosts and spirits, you'll go to them. And he said, if you worship me, representing Krishna, he said, then you will come to me. And he was saying this with his eyes closed, and then his index finger on his knee went like this. Very calmly, Prabhupada was saying, if you worship me, you'll come to me. And I was impressed that he was representing the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and I thought, Krishna must be a person like us. Previously, we'd been taught a vague idea of God, and Srila Prabhupada was really giving us a concrete idea of the personality of Godhead. So I was very grateful to him for what he was teaching. I felt grateful to be in the ashram. He was so generous. He was opening the ashrams to us, allowing us to take up some practice of devotional service.
When we first met Srila Prabhupada and we told him we were artists, he immediately decided to engage us in making some paintings. So the first painting that he engaged us in was painting Radha Krishna, a 4-foot by 4-foot painting of Radha Krishna, a show picture, and to be hung in the temple in San Francisco, which had no paintings. This was like bare walls or this and that's on the wall. And so I had no idea what Radha Krishna looked like. I mean, he just handed us his book cover, and I was going to copy it. So I did a grid. I did it, you know, exactly how artists do, block it off, wanted to make it exactly like that, you know. And in the course of doing it, I couldn't tell, it was a little tiny picture, what color are Krishna's eyes? So in those days, it was very common to go and ask Swamiji, who is called Swamiji. We could ask him questions, we could see him at almost any time of the day, except during his nap. And so I went up and asked him, Swamiji, what color are Krishna's eyes? And he got this very deep, meditative look on his face, as if he were looking far away, as if he were looking at Krishna, to be really honest with you. And a few moments later he says, they're blackish. And so I painted them blackish. And I noticed Radharani had a similar experience where she also had him look away as if he were looking at the form of the Lord.
The apartment for Srila Prabhupada was around the corner. And so there were darshans in the evening. My godbrother, Jyotir Dicha, made a nice garland for Srila Prabhupada out of some of this sterling silver pieces that we used for our jewelry business, flowers, and then Lakshmi, bills. So he made this wonderful garland. And so he said, let's go take this garland to Srila Prabhupada at the darshan. So we go around the corner, and I'm carrying the box with the garland in it. Jyotir's a step in front of me. So we go up to the door, knock on the door. The door opens, and Prabhupada's seated in those familiar poses, low table, cushions behind him, leaning back on the cushions with his knees up, and he's looking very, very regal and saintly. And so Jyotir turns around and takes the garland out of the box, puts it around Prabhupada's neck, and pays obeisances. And so I'm standing in the middle of the room with an empty box, with my mouth open, looking at Srila Prabhupada, just, stunned, overwhelmed. And so Prabhupada looks up at me and says, and what is in the box? And so I look in the box and look at him and say nothing, and everyone just laughed. They just laughed. They thought it was must have thought I was foolish. But someone explained to Srila Prabhupada that I had carried his garland in the box. So from that point forward, what I've been trying to do is put some service in the box, so that the next time I see Srila Prabhupada, I can say, here, Srila Prabhupada, this is what is in the box, some service that I have rendered to you.
So when the big limousine pulled up in front, we were all waiting for Srila Prabhupada I'm back in Los Angeles, and Srila Prabhupada's coming to the temple. He got out of a big black limousine. Devotees were throwing flower petals in the pathway. Mataji's from up above, throwing flower petals. Urjasvat was standing near him, trying to assist. He had a garland in his hand or something, maybe, I can't remember. And of course there's footage of all this. But so Prabhupada walked through the middle of the temple room, and he walked over to the front of the altar and waited for the deity doors to open. They opened. Srila Prabhupada offered prostrated obeisances to each set of deities. Then he went and got on his Vyasasan. And he gave, I don't remember the sequence. Was it Guru Puja first and then class, or class and Guru Puja? I don't remember. But what struck me, that I'll always remember, is during Guru Puja, the devotee was singing Sri Guru Charana Padma, and it was, for about half of the kirtan, we were pretty much just, all of us were just like rocking back and forth, maybe like a slight Swami step, the whole room. And Prabhupada was looking out at the room. At one point he went like this. He went like this. When he did that, it was like the whole temple room, all the devotees became ecstatic, and we all just jumped up and we were all dancing. All of us were just dancing madly and wildly. And I was thinking, how powerful is this personality that he just, with one little tiny motion of his palm, the whole temple room went nuts.
He was going to give a lecture. They had asked Prabhupada to give a lecture at the Hindu Center there.
one of the few Hindu centers in America in 1975. And so Prabhupada was going to go over and give a lecture in Hindi. And Tamal Krishna Maharaj wanted a few devotees to come along with him. Not the whole crowd, that wouldn't work, but, and somehow or other, my wife and I at the time were asked, would you come along? You'd be part of the devotees that come. And Prabhupada's just going to give a talk in Hindi, and so you just be there. And I said, oh, very wonderful, very nice. And so we all arrived at the Hindu center early, and Prabhupada showed up. And then we were all paying obeisances, and Prabhupada was trying, of course we were, you know, sometimes we were so excited in those days we didn't really use our heads properly. We didn't leave a path for Prabhupada to walk through the bodies that were laying on the floor. So Prabhupada came in the temple, and the rest of the Hindus, the Indians, they were standing. But then when he got to his devotees, we were all paying obeisances, and unfortunately there was no way for him. So he had to kind of tiptoe through the group. And so I was one of the people that he almost stepped on it to get through. So he went, he sat down on the Vyasasan, and he started to give this lecture in Hindi. And behind there was a lot of talk and noise, chastising of children, and children shrieking occasionally. In other words, this is a social event for the local Hindu community. And there was a Swami there, but they didn't really stop there. They're talking, and you could hear ladies in the background and gentlemen over here talking, and an occasional child chasing another one in the back. And so after a couple of minutes of this, Prabhupada stopped. And he looked around at everyone in the back of the room, and we were all up front. Then he looked at us, and he started this lecture in English. He's just switched over into English instead of, it seemed like, I've come here for you. But they are so interested, and they don't understand. So he was giving a lecture to them and for their benefit. So he just shifted and gave the lecture to us. And I just thought that was so, it was so nice to be there for him, because they weren't going to pay much attention to him. He shifted to his children.
One of the first places we met him was in Dallas. He arrived for a press conference, and we assembled in the VIP room. The reporters were there. One reporter was, actually the first reporter was quite mean-minded and wasn't respectful. He asked Srila Prabhupada rather bluntly, why did you come here? And it was quite aggressive. And to diffuse the reporter's aggressiveness, Prabhupada didn't say anything. And the silence continued and continued and continued for about a half a minute or more. And the reporter was quite surprised he wasn't getting a response that he expected. But Prabhupada was just taking control of the situation. And after the silence, he calmed everybody down, and he pleased the devotees. He said, these are my children. So that kind of explanation to the reporter made sense. Okay, you've come to see your children, as it were, your spiritual children. And the devotees, of course, felt very happy that Prabhupada was thinking of them.
Another incident that happened several times when I was traveling with Srila Prabhupada over that year, someone would send, naturally, a flyer, a brochure. We didn't have DVDs in those days, but some kind of form of advertising Krishna consciousness. Whatever it might be. It would be a flyer, a booklet, a little brochure, and Srila Prabhupada would always receive these in the mail. And if it did not have his name on it, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, he would immediately have us call. It didn't matter if it was in the middle of the night, it didn't matter what time of day it was. It was a very, very significant thing in his eyes. Me, I didn't understand why. But then he explained to me one time that if the spiritual master's name is not put there, along with whatever work we do, then that is the beginning of fall down. That means that the disciple is not acknowledging the spiritual master as everything coming from him. And it can be so subtle. A person can feel that they're doing perfectly fine. And I know many incidents of this, and also Sruta has told me that he would even call people in the middle of the night in Australia when it would happen. So, you know, any place in the world is my point. That was a very important issue for Srila Prabhupada. And along that line also, I remember there's this wonderful advertisement done in the very early days on Back to Godhead. I think it was done by Rai Rama, I'm not really sure. But the advertisement said, "This man has changed the world." Have you ever seen that? It was on the back of Back to Godhead, or it was "This man has changed the world," this picture of Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada was so upset when he saw this. He said, the disciples should never refer to the spiritual master as a man. This is aparat, and it's the beginning of fall down. So sometimes when I hear someone say he was a great man, I just cringe. And I go, I don't know if I say anything, they'll think I'm a fanatic. But the fact is, this is what he said. And he's usually right.
As I mentioned previously, when Prabhupada came to Geneva, there were many notable personalities, scholars, writers, scientists, who came to visit Srila Prabhupada in the temple. And in his quarters, there were many room conversations. One such memorable conversation was with a Swiss author and researcher of myths, who had been a personal friend of Timothy Leary, who needs no introduction, the propagator of the LSD culture, and a very famous Swiss-German writer, Friedrich Dürrenmatt, who's actually studied, he's a world-famous writer. So Sergius Golovin was a friend of these, a contemporary of these gentlemen, and he had quite a following in the capital of Switzerland, Bern. He was considered very avant-garde, a spiritualist, a researcher of esoteric spirituality. And so I had invited him to come meet Srila Prabhupada, and he accepted. So on June 5th, Golovin traveled from Bern to Geneva, and you know, I brought him into Srila Prabhupada's quarters, and Prabhupada looked up, and Golovin said, "Thank you for inviting me." And Prabhupada indicated he could take a seat on the floor. We had little cushions. He sat down. And so Prabhupada said, "So, do you have any questions?" And the man said nothing. And did he understand Srila Prabhupada? Why isn't he answering? He's a writer, he's an intelligent person. Why is he just silent? And then I started, becoming very panicky within myself, like, why did I invite this man? Prabhupada just asked him if he had any questions, and he's not answering. And then just at that point, the man said, "No, I have no questions. I'm just very happy to be here in your presence." And then I felt relieved. I thought, well, at least this gentleman knows that he's in the presence of someone great. And then there was silence again. And Prabhupada didn't begin speaking, and Golovin kept quiet. And again, I started getting all nervous. Why had I arranged for this? What would Prabhupada say? And then again, at that point, just as my doubts were crystallizing, Prabhupada asked for the harmonium. And a devotee handed him the harmonium, and Prabhupada began to play the harmonium, began to make bhajan. And he played and he began singing, just like that. And it was the most intense solo bhajan I had ever heard or seen Prabhupada do. And he continued for 30 minutes with his eyes closed. And, you know, it was so clear to me that Prabhupada was in a place I have yet to be able to understand. And after 30 minutes, you could hear a pin drop. You couldn't, Prabhupada was chanting and playing, but everyone was it was a total meditation of everybody on Prabhupada. And after 30 minutes, Prabhupada finished his bhajan, and he looked up at everybody. And again, we were back to silence. And Golovin said to Prabhupada, "Thank you so much. It's been an honor to be in your presence." And then Prabhupada said, "Thank you," tilting his head. And then he looked at me as Golovin was getting up to take leave. And he said, "Make sure he gets prasadam." That was it. And I thought, Prabhupada could preach in any situation. A so-called, big man with big thoughts who had not a single thing to say to Prabhupada. What did Prabhupada see? Did he see somebody who was ignorant? Perhaps. Did he see somebody who was receptive? And that the only way to get Krishna to this man was to chant. And so that's what Prabhupada did. And what I take away from that is that every situation was a preaching situation for Prabhupada. And there was no menu or a formula that fit all, that Prabhupada could reciprocate with each and every suffering conditioned soul in a way that only Prabhupada, being a pure devotee of Krishna, could understand would deliver Krishna consciousness. And I always remembered after that have no preconceptions about who is worthy and what is the proper way or formula to preach, but we have a vast array of tools that Prabhupada gave us, and any one of them, in this case, the holy names, a bhajan, and prasadam, were what was required.
Prabhupada was coming down into the temple room for Guru Puja and to give Srimad Bhagavatam class. And at that time, all the leaders, all the devotees were there. But during Mangal Artik, the devotees were there, but none of the leaders were there, hardly at all. There was maybe one or two sannyasis there. Most of the sannyasis at that time were GBC men, and they were all meeting in GBC meetings. They weren't coming to Sundar Artik. No one was coming to Sundar Artik, the evening Artik, and hardly anyone was coming to Mangal Artik. So I thought Prabhupada should know this. So I came into Prabhupada's room, offered my obeisances, and I said, "Srila Prabhupada, the devotees, the GBC men, are all there for your program, Guru Puja, and for Srimad Bhagavatam class in the morning. But practically none of them are attending Mangal Artik, and none of them are coming to Sundar Artik, evening Artik, and I just felt that you should know." When Prabhupada understood the situation, he said, basically just said, "Thank you very much," and he waved his hand, dismissed me. And immediately he called all the GBC in. And he then told them, he ordered them, that from now on your GBC meetings must end, I think it was a half an hour before the evening Artik. All of you must attend the evening Artik. And all of you must attend Mangal Artik from now on also. And I remember the next morning when all the leaders of our movement were there. And as Srila Prabhupada speaks about specifically, I remember a purport in the Bhagavad Gita where Prabhupada talks about how faith is created by the association of devotees. And it just felt so impactful having all the leaders of our movement there during Mangalartik. I remember feeling this incredible feeling of accomplishment of Srila Prabhupada that you know, the movement is spread all over the world, and I felt very, very blissful and secure in that. And it also reminded me how one of the main mandates from Srila Prabhupada to the GBC is that they travel to all their temples. I don't know how much it's being done currently, but that they would travel to the temples and give classes and enliven the devotees.
So right after the San Francisco Rath Yatra in 1971, it wasn't like now where you have hundreds of life members helping right before the Rath Yatra, and at that point it was still a big Rath Yatra in Golden Gate Park, but we just had the San Francisco devotees and the Berkeley devotees, which there were only maybe 15 or 20 in Berkeley, and the LA devotees came up like the day before, but we're working really hard. I didn't get much sleep. All the devotees were like that. And right after Rath Yatra, we had to clean up everything. So when got back to the temple in Berkeley, it must have been like late at night, maybe like 10 or 11. So then the next morning, the temple president at that point was Yasodhananda, and he said, he came and wake us up and said, Prabhupada called, he's coming over here. It wasn't scheduled because he was staying in San Francisco. Prabhupada's coming like in an hour. So we get up, we take a quick shower. He's coming in like 6:30 or something like that. Ended up, it was about a half hour later, like right at the greeting of the deities. So we had like an hour to clean up the temple, which we had let slide because we were just worried about the San Francisco Rath Yatra. So we cleaned up the halls and the temple room really quick. We put everything outside where the garbage area is, and so it was presentable. We thought, he's coming to the temple room, and they said he's going to give class, and then he's going to go back. So Prabhupada came in, and the class was like really short, probably because he might have known the devotees were totally tired. So he got up after the class. We did the Guru Puja and then a class. Then the first thing he does is he wants to inspect the temple. He walks out to the garbage area immediately, and he tells the temple president, this should be clean. And we're thinking, we did everything, and the first place he goes is the only place where we just dumped everything. So at that point I was thinking probably it must be some kind of mystic here.
In the course of our travels, we were in Frisco and LA, then we traveled to Boston and New York. We came back to Frisco, and it had been several months. So there were some new paintings on the wall, right? And one of them was by Jadharani. It was a beautiful painting of Narada, and he was standing there with a veena, and he looked like this. And it looked a lot like a Renaissance art. He looked like an angel or something. You get the idea, kind of wistful, ethereal, and so forth. And I thought it was great because I studied Renaissance art. I studied in cathedrals and galleries in Italy and in France, and I thought, oh, this is fantastic. Jadharani's come a long way, hasn't she? Isn't that new painting of Jadharani's great, Srila Prabhupada? No. And then he explained to me, he looks like a meat-eater and a womanizer, and Narad is an eternal brahmachari. And I'm like horrified, right? There's my judgment. And so then he said, it has Galtobra. Galtobra, he said, and believe me, I don't know what this, this is the word, I could be spelling it wrong or whatever. Galtoba means cheeks gone down. And that means the cheeks gone down are the cheeks of a meat eater and a womanizer. And then he pointed to a picture on the wall, one of the Dasi prints with the real round faces. And he says, this is what Krishna looks like. This is what the associates of Krishna look like. They have milk drinkers' faces, round. Of course, Gursinder always used to call my balloon faces and my balloon art, because there were always no muscular, like, what they look like. You can see in the Brijbasi prints, there's no definition of muscular stuff. Anyway, so I had to write Radharani. She remembers that very well. We talked today, and she remembers the Galtobra incident. And what it was, they were copying art from the Renaissance, which was very beautiful in its own right. I love a lot of that art, but his idea of transcendental art is completely different. And you have to remember that he knows what the spiritual world looks like, and we really don't. And according to Srila Prabhupada, in the spiritual world, they have smooth, beautiful faces and a certain long arms and very smooth, beautiful hands. And I think Bardraj actually studied this type of art more extensively than any of us. But it's very obvious in the early paintings that this type of art was what Prabhupada wanted. There was another incident where we were doing Gaura-Nitai drawing. Gaurasinder and I were doing a Gaura-Nitai drawing for making Gaura-Nitai deities in LA. This is like 68. And Gaurasinder was a weightlifter before, so he really understood muscle structure much better than I did. So he had some degree of definition in the pecs and the shoulders. Not a lot, but some. Just a little bit, lump, And Prabhupada immediately said, no, this is not to be done. They don't have the same muscle bodies like in your Western pictures. And this is a concern to a lot of people, that a lot of the paintings now, people don't know that this type of art wasn't liked by Srila Prabhupada. And it doesn't have a transcendental look. It has a more worldly look, because we have these type of bodies. So that's something that was very significant.
One of the many prominent personalities that came to visit Srila Prabhupada was a French professor, an Oriental Studies scholar, and a so-called expert in Hinduism named Jean Herbert. Quite famous in France, a disciple of Sri Aurobindo and a chief interpreter at the founding of the United Nations. And the man had a lot of weight in all senses of the word. He was a big guy. And I had gotten in touch with this professor and told him that Prabhupada was coming to Geneva and that we had a very active, busy program for Prabhupada that would not be complete unless he also participated. And we hoped he'd come talk with Prabhupada in the temple, in Prabhupada's quarters. So Professor Herbert agreed. And on the appointed day, when Professor Herbert was supposed to show up, he called about an hour before and said that sadly he would be unable to make it. And I was floored that how you could make an appointment, a commitment to the pure devotee. And I felt that somehow we were representing Prabhupada and he had made a commitment, and I just couldn't process standing up a pure devotee. Now, we had rented a Mercedes for Prabhupada's going to different events in Geneva, picking him up at the airport, going to the official reception at the Palace of the Government in Geneva, Prabhupada also spoke at the World Health Organization. And so we had this, fine vehicle that was sitting in the driveway as I was fuming over this professor's refusal to come. So I asked another devotee to join me, and I said, we're just going to go find out where this professor lives, and we're going to make a plea that, how can you do this? Prabhupada's waiting for you. So I got his address, and we had a map. This was before GPS. And, we got in the Mercedes, and we drove about a half an hour to his villa in the Geneva countryside outside the city. And he had a long driveway going up to this very nice country estate, this house. And so as we were driving up the driveway, he must have seen us because he was standing on the terrace watching the car approach. And when we got to the end of the driveway, we parked and we opened the doors, and I and the other devotee, we got out. We were dressed in dhotis, tilak, everything. He took one look at us. And of course, he understood the purpose of this visit. He knew immediately who we were, where we were coming from, and why. And without saying a word, he just said to me, wait 1 second while I get my hat. And he got into the car. And so we drove him to the temple. And it was just about the time that he was supposed to meet Srila Prabhupada. So Professor Herbert came in to the room, and he was greeted by Prabhupada, and he sat down on a cushion next to Prabhupada. Professor Herbert told Srila Prabhupada how pleased he was to be able to share his understandings of Krishna with Prabhupada, in particular a book that he had been working on for more than 20 years, which was just about to be published, in which he, the professor, would explain the yogic interpretation of the myth of Sri Krishna's childhood. You could just feel the storm clouds, forming above him, his head. Now, prior to his coming, I had gone to see Srila Prabhupada the day before and said, Prabhupada, tomorrow we're going to have this professor, and if you'd like to get familiar a little bit with where he's coming from, I have his book here. And Prabhupada said, yes, sit down and you can read portions of it for me. So it was written in French, and I did sight translation for Prabhupada. And the more I read, the more I could see Prabhupada's displeasure, And at one point, Prabhupada said, that's good. That's enough. So the scene was set for the intellectual battle of Kurukshetra, So when the professor was there, and he said that he had taken more than 20 years to write this book, Prabhupada dryly commented, and still there are mistakes. And the professor was so taken aback by this direct comment, he didn't know what to say. And then Prabhupada began to explain what Krishna consciousness is, and that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, not a myth. And strangely, the professor became quiet, perhaps out of being properly raised and polite, or maybe because he was really just submitting to a devotee of Krishna whose knowledge of Krishna was not mythical or fantastical or imaginary, but real. And I know that this professor made an impact on Prabhupada because in a letter Prabhupada wrote me some months later, Prabhupada still remembered this professor. And he said, and regarding the visit of Professor Jean Herbert, tell him that the whole point of jnana, as described by Krishna in Bhagavad Gita, is to come to an understanding that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And then Prabhupada started listing. The letter is like 90% verses. Tell him Sarvadharman Parityaja Mame Kung Sharanam. Tell him Yat Karoshi Yat Ashnasi. Tell him this. Prabhupada listed like 5 verses one after the other, because my understanding is that Prabhupada came to the West. He came to deliver us from Nirvishesha and Shunyavadi, from the impersonalism and the ignorance and the nihilism of speculators who deny Krishna and his supreme role as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And Prabhupada, again, as we saw so many times, was fearless. It didn't matter how big or famous anybody was. Prabhupada schooled him. Prabhupada put him in his place in a firm way. But in the end, the professor was glad. That was the magic, I think, of Prabhupada's preaching, that no one ever took it in the wrong way, rarely, if ever, that I saw. And he was very happy to come and happy to meet Prabhupada and glad he made it.
It was 1974, July, and I had traveled by traveling Sankirtan from Dallas to Washington, D.C., and I was going to get my Brahmin initiation from Srila Prabhupada. And the system was that you went up to his quarters, and Srila Prabhupada personally gave you the Gayatri Mantra. So I was, very excited. I was going to finally be alone with my spiritual master. And I had tried to think of a deep philosophical question that I could ask him. So I don't know how deep it was, but I don't remember. But so it was my turn to go in, and I saw Srila Prabhupada. He was sitting on a cushion behind a low table, and he was so effulgent and so beautiful. And I just felt so much awe, and I was also very, very nervous. I paid my obeisances, and I put the Guru Dakshin and the flowers on his table, and I stood up, and Srila Prabhupada was looking at me right in the eyes. And like so many devotees, you had that sense that he was just looking right into your heart and seeing all the dirt that's there, and also just everything about your soul. So then Srila Prabhupada asked me a question, and I couldn't understand what he said. So I said, "Excuse me, Srila Prabhupada?" And he said the question again, and I still couldn't understand him. So, I'd never had trouble understanding Srila Prabhupada, but the one time I'm alone with him, I can't understand what he's saying. So I had to ask him a third time, "Srila Prabhupada, I'm sorry, I just don't understand what you're saying." And then finally I understood, and he was just asking, "Are there any more people out there that waiting to be initiated?" And I said, "No, Srila Prabhupada." So at this point I wasn't going to ask any deep philosophical questions. So then he asked me to come sit beside him, and I did, and then he had me come closer, right next to him. And I was just feeling so overwhelmed to be sitting right next to Jagadguru, my spiritual master. And so he said to me, "So you know how to do this?" And he moved his fingers like you move for Gayatri Mantra. And I said, "Oh yes, Srila Prabhupada." But then when I tried to do it, I just couldn't do it. I was so overwhelmed. So he took his hand and he moved my fingers for me, which was really, so kind. And my realization was that even though I was acting like such a fool in front of my spiritual master, that he was never impatient or angry or disturbed or disgusted. He was just kind and compassionate, and I also really felt how Srila Prabhupada had unconditional love for me.
After Jyotir had given the garland to Srila Prabhupada, we sat down, and the room was full, and it was kind of a quiet space. No one was asking any questions, and Prabhupada was sitting back. And someone knocked on the door, and an old Indian woman came in. And Prabhupada looked at me and said, "Go get her a chair." And so I was struck by that. I was struck by the way that Prabhupada was so aware at all times, it seemed to me. And so when he said that, of course, my thought was, well, yeah, I need to get that lady a chair. And so before I could get there, someone else passed the chair over, and so I sat back down. But I always remember that and think that I need to protect and care for my wife, my sisters, my daughters, my mothers. That should be something that should be done. So that's what I took from that instruction that Prabhupada gave me, the only one. Go get her a chair.
When we were in Boston, Jadharani brought or sent a picture of Srila Prabhupada's Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and he was seated with a forest, a beautiful forest behind him. I thought it was a nice picture, nice green evergreens. And Srila Prabhupada took one look at it and said, "She has placed my Guru Maharaj in an American forest." Well, it looked like a cold climate trees, like evergreens and so forth. And I think that was the beginning of understanding that we need to make it look a little bit more like the transcendental realm, which of course is described as tropical mangoes, kadamba, frangipani, all the various tropical plants that exist in Vrindavan, Golok Vrindavan, that also exist like in Bengal or Hawaii or tropical climates. We became more aware of the fact that we needed to make the background appropriate, not have them situated in a Western country forest.
While I was in Mayapur attending the festival, I was, at this time I was still temple commander. I was temple commander there for about 4 months, and before and during and a little bit after the festival in 1976. And so we were trying to finish all the rooms for the devotees along the perimeter wall of Mayapur. And there was a huge influx of devotees coming, and I was in anxiety because I was a new temple commander. I didn't speak the language there, and we were behind schedule in getting the rooms ready. And of course, these are Prabhupada's devotees from around the world who are doing so much service. They deserve to come to Mayapur. I know Prabhupada wanted them to have very nice facility, so they felt very taken care of. And so, because as Prabhupada said, that Mayapur is our home. So in that mood, I was trying to get every person who came a little early. Some devotees came a little bit early for the festival. So I was trying to engage them, especially able-bodied devotees, in helping get the rooms ready for the other devotees. So I was in a little bit of a passionate mode. And I remember one specific incident of a devotee who had come, and he was a black-bodied devotee. He was very stout, seemed very strong. And I believe he would take morning prashana, but then he would disappear for the rest of the day. And he'd go into where the banana patch was, and he'd just chant Hare Krishna all day long. And I approached him and asked him if he would help. And he said, he's just in Mayapur just to chant Hare Krishna, and that's it. So that rubbed me a little bit the wrong way. And being temple commander and having that responsibility, I was frustrated, and I thought maybe that would set a precedent for other devotees. So I approached Srila Prabhupada at that time. I had pretty much the ability, carte blanche, to enter Srila Prabhupada's room. And even when I did, it was only for what I considered important things to ask Srila Prabhupada. I didn't want to bother him. But this time I thought it necessary, and so I entered Srila Prabhupada's room, offered my obeisances. And Srila Prabhupada was sitting there chanting japa. And so he was chanting japa, and I came in, offered my obeisance, and I said, Srila Prabhupada, I need to ask you something. And he, still fingering his beads, He turned towards me and he said, yes. I said, Srila Prabhupada, we're trying to get the rooms ready on the perimeter wall for all the devotees who are coming, and we're behind schedule. And so I'm trying to get every single devotee who's coming early who can to help us out. And there's one devotee in particular that's really frustrating me because he won't do any service. And he simply goes to the banana patch, and all day long, all he does is chant Hare Krishna. He won't do any service. And so Prabhupada was lightly, softly chanting as I was telling him this. His face a little bit turned away to me. And then when I finished saying he won't do any service, he stopped and he looked at me with a very grave look and he said, so, you think chanting Hare Krishna is not service? He said, that is the greatest service. And his eyes rolled back and he moved his head to the side, and I immediately felt like about a half inch big. I felt so humiliated, and I simply offered my obeisance and said, yes, thank you, Srila Prabhupada. Left the room and got what I consider one of the greatest personal instructions from my spiritual master to this day. And, you know, Prabhupada was so expert, and as you hear the memories of so many other devotees, you know, because he's in direct connection with Krishna all the time, it was so unpredictable to know what he was going to say in any given situation. And to another devotee in the same situation, he may give a completely different instruction, but he knew that was exactly what I needed to hear. And it was a very, I feel it's a very important instruction, a very, very vivid remembrance of that pastime with Prabhupada.
On May 29th, 1974, Prabhupada landed in Geneva, and he was accompanied by Satsvarup Goswami and Nitai. And we picked Prabhupada and his team up at the airport and brought him to the temple. And I was very busy with all the arrangements for Prabhupada's meetings and programs and the official reception by the governor of Geneva. And I was unaware of the fact that Lilavati, Dasi, a disciple of Prabhupada's, had come to Geneva to do typing for Prabhupada. And about 3 days into Prabhupada's visit, Prabhupada asked about Lilavati. And I didn't even know that she was in the temple. So I went to inquire about it. It turned out that Lilavati had arrived sick with hepatitis from India, and she had to go directly to the hospital. And she was spending the time Prabhupada was in Geneva hospitalized. So I came back to Prabhupada's room, and I said to Prabhupada, Prabhupada, she's still in the hospital. Like I actually knew what was going on, you know. And then Prabhupada said, we will go visit Lilavati in the hospital. Make arrangements immediately. So I rushed out and I told the devotees, we're all going to the hospital, get the car ready, get the cars ready, you know, Prabhupada's car, the cars for the devotees, prasadam, is there prasadam for me? Do we have maha for Lilavati? You know, does she have Prabhupada's books? You know. And finally, when everything was ready, I went back into Prabhupada's room and I said, Srila Prabhupada, we're ready now. And he said, very good. Now go. And Prabhupada stayed in the temple and sent everybody to the hospital to visit with Lilavati and give her prasadam and association. And what I take from that, obviously, is that Prabhupada remembered his servants. He cared for them. He felt for them. He missed them when they were not around. And he knew who everybody was.
When we would travel in the course of our travels, we would go from apartment to apartment. Rather than having bare walls, I would put Brijbasi prints all over the walls, you know, in Prabhupada's room. I would make a nice altar for him wherever we were, and I would put up pictures. And there was one particular picture that I thought was extremely beautiful. It was a picture of Radha Krishna, and it was very old style. It wasn't the average Brijbasi style. It was a very finely painted, older style of painting, in which Radharani had a choli on that was kind of translucent with little puff sleeves, and she looked very mature. And I thought it was beautiful. And Srila Prabhupada looked at it and said, "This picture is not good. Radharani looks like she looks like a 35 or 40-year-old woman. She looked too old in it. She didn't look like a young girl." So he commented on that he did not like that picture. He was very, very attuned to art, very specific in what he wanted and what the spiritual world looked like. It wasn't just what he wanted. You have to understand, it's his glimpse or his awareness of that dimension that we're not aware of. And so he wanted the figures to appear youthful, round-faced, flowing, that is without muscles, very long arms and delicate and graceful. Sometimes people say, who aren't devotees, they say, "Oh, who is that blue woman?" They think Krishna looks like a girl because he's so beautiful. But actually, he is very, very beautiful. And of course, he objected to the long, long hair. He wanted Krishna to have a little bit less hair, not flowing all over the place. He would complain about that. But Srila Prabhupada's understanding of transcendental art was very refined and very, very clear, very specific. And that standard of beauty is an unusual one. It's not a worldly standard of beauty. In other words, you can't take a photograph of a young guy and a beautiful girl and then just paint the guy blue and paint the girl golden, which is kind of what's happening now. It's really much beyond that. There has to be a certain transcendental look that we don't want to lose in the artwork, because that's actually the spiritual world as described to us by Srila Prabhupada.
The whole time that Srila Prabhupada is giving class, myself and Shadananda, another lady, were crying in the Halava and saying, well, this is service and separation, trying to console ourselves of, why we were absent from such a glorious and big event in our lives, that Srila Prabhupada had come to San Diego. And then after class, when everyone paid their obeisances, we ran to the kitchen door because that was the way out. And we stood at the kitchen door with our aprons on, and we had, with pranams, our hands folded, and because we knew that Srila Prabhupada would come by the kitchen door. And when he came down the stairs, he was alone. No one was following him. He had got up from the Vyasa sign really quick during the when everyone was offering obeisances, and he came down the stairs without anyone else. And we could see the silk of his dhoti like billowing as he came down the stairs. And then there was a bookcase underneath the stairwell, and Srila Prabhupada paused there and he looked at the books. And then he saw Shadananda and myself were standing at the kitchen door, and I felt like Srila Prabhupada knew that there were some devotees that hadn't made it to the class, and he wanted to have give us a personal experience. And so he stopped and he offered obeisances. And so many devotees I've heard the experience that they have when Srila Prabhupada looks at you, he's looking at you, even if it's in a huge room with lots of devotees, but when you've made personal eye contact with Srila Prabhupada. And it was like that. He looked at me and he offered his folded hands.
Actually, I associated with Srila Prabhupada mostly by attending his classes. I attended 10 or 12 or 15 classes. And I usually saw him in public. not in his apartment. Or he spoke with so much authority and gravity and seriousness that his disciples were very, very attentive to what he said. You could hear a pin drop in the room. I remember in the Toronto temple how quiet it was in the morning when Srila Prabhupada gave the Srimad Bhagavatam class. It was so wonderful to hear the silence of the devotees and the receptiveness. Their ears were just wide open. I also heard Prabhupada give a class at the Sunday feast in Toronto. The audience then was mostly people from India who had come to the West to work, and Srila Prabhupada addressed that. He was telling the Indians that they shouldn't forget Krishna. And he quoted the verse, Patram Pushpam, if you offer Krishna a leaf or some water or fruit, Krishna accepts it. So he said it's very easy to serve Krishna, even in your house. But if you forget Krishna, it won't be very good. He said, you've come to the West to work, and now you have good apartments, good cars. But if you forget Krishna, then in your next life you'll become a cockroach in your car. I think the Indian people may have heard strong words before from saintly people. It's not unusual for a saintly person to speak in strong words to wake up a person. So this is a case of that.
Prabhupada came to Chicago in '74 there was a Ratha Yatra there, and then in '76. And in 1976, Uddhava Shloka was the temple president, and right after the Ratha Yatra, we had, because Prabhupada was dealing with all sorts of devotees at that point, there was a big Radha Damodar party initiation, they had a lot of buses, so Uddhava Shloka got something at least for us, and then Prabhupada came to the room. So Uddhava Shloka introduced, Prabhupada said, Mrigendra, he's organizing the airport distribution. So Prabhupada says immediately, so what do you tell them? So I start out, well, we tell them that George Harrison helped print this book, and I stopped for a second. Immediately he nailed me, and he said, you should tell them something about the book. So I felt like kind of bad, but we were selling books on George Harrison's name, basically, a lot of things. So at that point, when I saw Prabhupada, it was like heavy energy, and it was like total, he was deep and very powerful.
Srila Prabhupada's sole visit to Switzerland was from May 29th to June 8th, 1974. He arrived in the morning at the airport. We went to greet Prabhupada with special authorization to go out onto the tarmac, onto the runways. We were accompanied by Swiss National Television. And Prabhupada was accompanied by Satsvarup Goswami and Nitai. And after we brought Prabhupada back to the temple for resting, we had the official reception at the City Hall of Geneva, the Hôtel de Ville, where Prabhupada was going to be officially welcomed by the governor of Geneva. Sometimes devotees think it was the mayor of Geneva, like in Paris, where the vice mayor received Prabhupada in Paris. But in Geneva, it was the governor of the canton of Geneva, which previously had been an independent country. So they're very proud of their canton and city of Geneva. And so Prabhupada was addressed by the governor as Your Divine Grace, which I thought was very special because, you know, for non-devotees, that's not the easiest way to address Prabhupada. He minced no words. He said, Your Divine Grace in the beginning of his welcome speech, and he said, Your Divine Grace at the end. And then Prabhupada gave a response to the governor, and he talked about Varnashram Dharma, and he explained how a perfect society is organized and how it functions. And at the end of that, there was some small conversation between Prabhupada and the governor. And the governor asked about a concern that he was feeling. He said, Your Divine Grace, if everybody joins your movement, what will happen to the economy? And Prabhupada remembered that the mayor was worried about that. Going forward about 10 months, it was time for Mahapur Festival 1975. And I went to India with a few Swiss devotees, and we had booked our flight through Bombay to Calcutta. And when we arrived in Bombay, in Juhu by taxi from the airport, Prabhupada was just leaving the compound for morning walk with an entourage of devotees. So he immediately told the taxi driver to stop the taxi, and we jumped out of the taxi, and we just did 180 degrees, turned and started going on morning walk with Prabhupada. And everyone was talking about how Srila Prabhupada was about to leave for the Mahapur festival. And no one knew what flight Prabhupada was taking. And everyone was eager to find out what flight it was so they could book on the same flight. But by the time it was known what flight Prabhupada was on, the flight was fully booked. So no one could get on. And I looked at our tickets from Switzerland, and by pure serendipity, we were on Prabhupada's flight. So when the devotees took Prabhupada to the airport with a rip-roaring kirtan, they couldn't get past security, but we did. Myself and two other devotees from Switzerland. And everyone was saying, who are those devotees? How did they get in? I tried. How did they pull that off? And so we went to the waiting room with Prabhupada, and it was a small waiting room back then. And suddenly I was thrust into a situation where there were very few devotees, Prabhupada's secretary, his servant, myself and two other devotees from Switzerland, and you could hear the kirtan in the distance, but that was it. So I decided I had to be very Krishna conscious because Prabhupada might notice me, and I didn't want to look anything but Krishna conscious. So I was chanting my japa, and I was going back and forth, pacing. And as I turned to pace back, I saw that Prabhupada was calling me. And it was almost like in the movies or something. I turned in both directions, like I couldn't believe Prabhupada was calling me. And no, Prabhupada went like this. So I came up to Srila Prabhupada, and I still remember the color of the cushions. They were a plastic blue, like a light blue. And then Prabhupada tapped the seat right next to him for me to sit down. And I sat down right next to Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, so, how is the governor of Geneva? Is he still worried about the Swiss economy if everyone joins our movement? And at that moment, I realized that Srila Prabhupada knew who I was. Because it's not that Prabhupada always called us by our name when we were in his presence. And so for, someone who is perhaps insecure, you wonder, well, does Prabhupada really know who I am? And what I learned from that experience was Prabhupada not only remembered me, he not only remembered the governor, he remembered everything that had been said, and he remembered that that was the service that I was performing to him. And he could pick up exactly where we had left off. The same conversation, knowing exactly who was doing what for him. And that gave me an enormous amount of inspiration that truly no service is unrecognized by Srila Prabhupada.
Okay, this was in Dallas, Gurukula, and Srila Prabhupada was visiting. And one afternoon he was giving a lecture, a conversation in his garden, and I wanted to go hear him, but my authority said, better you just do your service, that will please Srila Prabhupada. So me and this other devotee went upstairs and we were making flower garlands. And then finally we looked at each other and thought, are we crazy? You know, we can do this at midnight if we have to, but when will we have an opportunity to hear our spiritual master again? So we ran downstairs and there was a bamboo fence in front of the garden, and so we were peeking through the bamboo fence, and Srila Prabhupada wasn't that far away, we could actually hear him. And then all of a sudden Prabhupada turned around and looked at us and said, who is that? And I thought, oh no, now I'm in trouble. But somebody peeked out and said to Srila Prabhupada, it's two Matajis. And he said, oh, ask them to come in. So it was packed, but they had to scoot over and let us in because Srila Prabhupada had personally asked us. And I don't remember anything from that lecture except one boy asked Srila Prabhupada, why is Krishna blue? And Srila Prabhupada said, because he wants to be.
In Boston, Srila Prabhupada, actually it was at Gorsunder's, he was constantly asking him about the Gayatri Mantra. Srila Prabhupada was not that keen on giving the Gayatri Mantra. He actually didn't think it was that important. He was more interested in our learning to chant Hare Krishna and follow the principles. But it appeared that because Gorsunder was very scholarly, and also Pradyumna and a few others, that he decided to give the Gayatri Mantra. So I met Gorsunder on the street, and he was all happy. He had just shaved off all his hair, and there was going to be, I was coming home from shopping groceries or something, but we were living with Prabhupada, and so I was surprised by this, that there was going to be a Gayatri Mantra initiation. And this was really something that really was requested more by Gorsunder than was promoted by Srila Prabhupada at that time. In any case, I was a little disappointed that he was not going to give it to us as well, Jadharani and I and Annapurna. So I felt a little left out. He did the next evening have a separate one for the ladies. He had this one evening, and the next one was for the next evening. But at that time, I felt a little left out. And so whenever we got ready to go to the temple for this sacrifice, fire sacrifice, I decided that I would stay home. Maybe I might have been sulking a little bit. It was my nature at that time to sometimes sulk. I'm embarrassed. I don't know how to put it any other way. So, I was young. Anyway, so when Srila Prabhupada, or rather he became Srila Prabhupada in Boston, but I don't know if he was still Swamiji or Srila Prabhupada. That part I can't remember. When they got ready to leave, and they picked us up, I said, I'm not really feeling that well. I think I'll just stay home. And of course, I was just sulking. And Srila Prabhupada knew. He read my mind. Have you ever lived in the house with someone that could read your mind night and day and know everything you're thinking, planning, and doing? It's a bit of an experience. So they went off to the temple. And I sat there and sulked for a few minutes. And then I thought, what am I doing? This is ridiculous. I'm missing out. I'm missing out on hearing him speak. And I loved to hear him speak. I mean, I could just listen to him speak for hours at a time. It was like I would be completely disconnected from the entire material existence while Srila Prabhupada was speaking. I was completely focused, and it was completely blissful. You got the experience of Satchidananda, eternity, bliss, and knowledge during that time. So then I thought, what am I doing? This is ridiculous. I'm missing out on something I love just because of my stupid mind. So I went running down the street and ran all the way to the temple, which was quite a long way. I think it was like 8 or 9 blocks. And I came bursting in the door and bowed down, and Srila Swamiji or Srila Prabhupada said at that moment, "Oh, I was just thinking, where is that girl? And now Krishna has sent." And he said, "I was wondering how you could stay away. You love to hear me speak so much." And so I swallowed my stupid pride and enjoyed the ceremony. And then, of course, the next evening he gave us a similar ceremony with the Gayatri initiation, which seems to have taken on a huge importance that at the time he didn't seem to place that much importance on it.
A short, sweet story that was told to me by Hiranmayi Dasi, a French-Swiss devotee who lives in Montreal, was about another French-Swiss devotee named Krishnakanta Dasi. Krishnakanta was one of the very first Swiss devotees to join in Geneva. And when Prabhupada came, she was ill. She had some affliction in her leg and had strict orders from the doctor to keep her leg up. But when she heard Prabhupada was going to speak at the World Health Organization at the UN, she very much wanted to attend. Of course, there was no room in the car for a brahmacharini, and she decided she was going to hitchhike from the temple to the World Health Organization, which she did. She managed to get in, and she attended the entire lecture that Prabhupada gave. On the way out, Srila Prabhupada noticed her and said to us, "How will this brahmacharini get back to the temple? Who is looking after her?" And we all looked at each other, clueless, having given no concern whatsoever to that problem. And then we made arrangements for her to get back safely to the temple. And I realized that even the humble servants of Srila Prabhupada were recognized by Prabhupada. And that's a theme that I saw recur over and over, that no servant and no service was too small to escape Srila Prabhupada's notice and care.
Over the next 3 days, Prabhupada, of course, gave class. And this is the old temple on East Jefferson. And my godbrother, who brought me to Detroit, Jyotir Prabhu, had made a palanquin for Srila Prabhupada. And the palanquin was inside the front door to the left in a big open closet. So Prabhupada came in the first day and he looked at the palanquin, and then he just went upstairs to the attic that had been reconverted into the temple room. And so on the third day, Prabhupada came in the front door and he looked at the palanquin and he actually went and sat on it. And I was thinking, oh, Prabhupada's sitting on the palanquin that Jyotir made for him. So he sat sideways. Brahmananda Prabhu went over and touched Prabhupada's legs, indicating that he should turn. And so Prabhupada turned and crossed his legs and sat regally on the palanquin. And so the devotees called for myself and Jyotir Dicha and 2 other devotees to come and carry the palanquin. And I was, of course, quite nervous. As I touched the handle to the palanquin, sweat beads popped out on my head. I was thinking, oh, we can't drop Prabhupada because that would be the end of the world. So as we all stood up straight, I was the tallest person. And so I had to kind of scrunch down a bit to make it level. And I was thinking that we have to make things nice for Prabhupada. We can't inconvenience Prabhupada or make him uncomfortable. And so we were all different sizes, and I don't know, probably came to the movement at different times, but none of that mattered then. What mattered was that we didn't inconvenience Prabhupada in any way. So we carried him across the floor, up 2 steps, there's a little platform, and then turn left and go up the stairs, going toward the 2nd floor. And so we were all, I was thinking that, you know, we can't drop Prabhupada. And we have to watch his head's coming close to the ceiling. So we came up to that second level, and we couldn't go up any farther with the Pelican because the stairs become more tight as it's an old building. So we had to let him down. He got off the Pelican and went up into the temple room, and of course we grabbed flowers from the Pelican. But my thought was that if we look at ISKCON as Prabhupada's body, then we're all helping to carry that body. We all have to cooperate in order that Prabhupada's not inconvenienced at any point. So that was the realization I had from that particular thing. We have to really work together. It doesn't matter our size, shape, when we came, you know, what our different services might be, but they all have to be coordinated in such a way that Prabhupada's movement grows, Prabhupada's not inconvenienced, Prabhupada's not upset by the way we act and treat each other. So that was the realization.
I saw him as a philosopher, as a teacher, someone who really surpassed the professors I had at the university, someone who surpassed the generation of my parents in being able to give advice to young people. He surpassed the countercultural heroes that we had. He was just so perfect in many ways. As an author, as a philosopher, as a teacher, and as a revolutionary also, as someone who had a real message, someone who had the backbone to deliver the message and tell people the truth. He wasn't wishy-washy or unconvinced about what he had to give. He had strong conviction, extremely well-developed conviction and faith, very advanced faith in Krishna.
When I've seen videos of Srila Prabhupada, like on YouTube, movies, Acharya, whatever, if you observe, if anyone observes Srila Prabhupada, that he was the embodiment of devotion, and that down to the tiniest detail. And we've heard that Prabhupada, even on his desk, that he would have a place for his pen. And it was when he picked that pen up, everything was for Krishna. Every movement, every word, every glance, it was all divinely inspired he was completely directed by Krishna, and you could totally experience and feel that just observing anyone. I think anyone, even a materialist, if they go and look at footage of Srila Prabhupada, his movements are not those of an ordinary man of this world. They're divine. And that's so powerful, an impression in the mind, to see someone whose every single word, every breath, every movement, every glance, everything that he did was for Krishna. It's just so attractive.
Srila Prabhupada has always touched me in a very personal way. And it's his personalism that touched me, that my relationship with him was a very personal relationship. And my remembrances and memories and interactions, minor interactions that I had with Srila Prabhupada, he made them very personal. And this is one of the things that attracts me to Srila Prabhupada, is that he continues to be personal in my life, and that he's never left. He's always interacting with me and comforting me and giving me instructions. He reasons ill who says that Vaishnavas die. Srila Prabhupada is still here.
I think the thing that impressed me most about Srila Prabhupada, because there's 26 qualities of a pure devotee, and it's actually really hard for me to just focus on one, but remembering those times when I was with Srila Prabhupada, and remembering also how Srila Prabhupada told us that his purpose in creating the International Society for Krishna Consciousness was to create men of perfect character. So I think that quality, in my mind, really exemplifies Srila Prabhupada, because his character was so perfect that even if you didn't hear Prabhupada speak, just his hand gesture or his facial expression, the way he dealt with everything was so perfect, and so, so many qualities embodied those interactions between Prabhupada and others, such as his humility, peacefulness, freedom from anger, and his his perfect timing in how he would do things and say things. That seems, in my mind, sums up more than anything the quality that I remember most about Srila Prabhupada, that he had this perfect character.
The one quality that I always believed Srila Prabhupada had that made him stand out from everybody else was how he really loved us. He just exhibited his love in all his dealings with the devotees, and no matter what we did, he still loved us.
The thing that really stuck out for me was Prabhupada's concern for the welfare of all of us. And he made such a great sacrifice. I mean, I can't imagine what it must have been like. I did sail, actually, as a young person in my 20s on a ship and experienced a storm, etc. But I can't imagine what it must have been like for him to make that sacrifice, to come to a place that he didn't know anyone, didn't have any money, was depending completely on the Lord. And it obviously, he had to have a great sense of compassion and great concern for others, other than than for his own comfort. Otherwise, he would have stayed in India. So that's one thing that really sticks out: the great sacrifice he made to give us information that will save us.
When Prabhupada was writing or he was speaking, I just took it like they say, that not that he's speaking, but Krishna is speaking directly through him. And so that's how I took him. Not that he's this body or whatever. I just took him that he's the messenger of Krishna. And that's all he wanted. He didn't want to be served personally. He just wanted us to follow his instructions and try to please him, and he was trying to please his spiritual master, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And that was one of the main motivations, one of the things that kept us going. I remember in Atlanta, he was saying that his spiritual master would bless us more than even he would. So we took that as boy, this is extra. Now we're getting double here. This is like, we're not only got Prabhupada, now we got Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati behind us. So that's kept us going.
And I remember one class where Prabhupada was saying, of course, there were days there when I didn't feel very well, because some of us, a lot of us got sick, and I was feeling particularly ill that day, but I was in class and trying to listen to Prabhupada's words and stay awake. And then I hear Prabhupada say, if one has chanted this Maha Mantra sincerely one time, then he is not long for this world. Meaning that probably this birth, if not very soon, we're out here, we're finished. And he went on to explain like that just one time is all it takes. So here we are chanting 16 rounds a day and so much kirtan. So Prabhupada, I realized what you've done is you've just thrown us in this ocean of Krishna consciousness, where really just a drop is all it really takes. But Prabhupada was inundating us with so much Krishna consciousness. It was concentrated Krishna consciousness. You know, he wanted us to have the ISKCON sandwich, the morning program, full day of service, and an evening program. He's just constant. And a lot of it, I'm sure, was because we were extremely contaminated. We needed to be purified. But that struck me, that's all it really takes, and yet you're giving us so much of yourself. He would go all through the day, sleep hardly at all at night. And here I'm sick. I was at the time in my 20s, and yet I knew Prabhupada was sick because he was sneezing, and I could tell he didn't feel very well, and there was mucus. I'm sure he felt worse than I did, but he's there giving class, and I'm there trying to stay awake. And I realized that, you know, out of your kindness and your love, you're giving us everything. You're not holding back anything. You're giving us this ocean of Krishna consciousness, when, as he said, only a few drops is all it would take.
There's so many qualities of Srila Prabhupada that so many of us have seen over the years when we had the fortune of associating with him. But if one quality stands out in my mind, in my heart, it's just the unmitigated authenticity of Srila Prabhupada. That here was someone who would never cheat me. Here was someone who was actually what he said he was. Here was someone who knew Krishna. And there was no need to speculate. There was no need for Prabhupada to think over things that he already just knew. And in his personal habits, Prabhupada followed exactly the same program he asked us to follow, just better. He got up earlier. When we had the good fortune of Prabhupada's company for 10 days in a very small temple, I could see with my own eyes what Prabhupada was doing. In the morning, you could see the light coming out from underneath the door. Prabhupada was already up at 2:30 in the morning. He was chanting rounds. He was dictating the Srimad Bhagavatam translations and purports. He was eating frugally. He was living humbly. Prabhupada was, for me, the embodiment of someone who had realized God and who could give God to others. And somehow I happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I could see it myself. I didn't have to read about it only. I didn't have to ask others about it only. I was there by Krishna's mercy.
Je anilo premadana karuna prachu